This week, I'm talking about Russian literature. Now, if you've ever read Tolstoy or Dostoyevsky, you know that it is an experience unto itself. There are different thematic elements, the pronunciation of names, all of these things make these books both fascinating and complex. My goal in this week's episode is to help you not only understand how to approach Russian literature, but how to appreciate it. Let's get into it. Welcome to this week's episode of the Read Well podcast. My name is Eddie Hood, and I'm your host, where I believe it's more important to read well than to be well read. So grab your favorite book, open up your notes, and let's get ready to learn something fascinating. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Read Well podcast. This is episode 48 on how to read Russian literature. Now, if you've ever jumped into these books before, you might have felt a little overwhelmed because it's not like picking up your standard sort of American novel because it's structured differently. The names are not only hard to pronounce, but they're structured differently as well. There's a lot going on. And so what I thought I would do today is give you some background on these books so that you can get into them and really enjoy them. And the reason why I'm doing that is because starting today, actually, in the book club that I host, we are going to begin reading The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, which is one of the greatest books ever written, in my opinion. He is my favorite author of all time. We'll get into why that is and who he was. But if you are in the book club, I want to make sure you're armed with some information and some tools to help you really get the most out of this book and future works of Russian literature that we might read together. Now, if you're not in the book club, this is still a useful episode to you because these are fantastic works of fiction that I encourage you to read, but I want you to be really prepared before you jump in. So let's get started with the tips on how to read Russian literature. I think it's important before you open any of these books to understand some of the history behind Russia. Now, I am going to put out the disclaimer that I am not a historian of any kind. I'm not an expert on Russian events, but I will tell you that there are some things as a reader we need to be aware of in order to really appreciate these books. And the first is that, the structure of the government made a huge impact on these authors and how they worded their texts, as well as the Orthodox Church at the time. And then there was an intellectual movement taking place called the intelligentsia, which we're going to talk about. But let's do these in order. So first, I'd like to talk about the actual structure of the government. For hundreds of years, up until 1917, the Russian government was structured as a czarist regime, Tsarist. You might have heard of the Russian Tsar, Tsar. Now, this person was autocratic in the sense that he had absolute power and really had to answer to nobody except to God. He had full control over the entire empire and would often rule that empire in a very bloody and iron fist way in order to not only expand it, but protect it. This structure caused a big rift between the haves and the have-nots, right? Shocker, this happens all of the time. But for the people in rule and for the Tsar himself, they of course controlled everything. And then most of the population of Russia up until 1861 were serfs. So serfdom was a very big sort of way of living. And all it means to be a serf is it's essentially likened to slavery. These people were tied to their land and they really had no sort of way of moving up in the world. They were really slaves. And so this serfdom structure was in place until 1861, at which point there was this emancipation reform that happened, and it became essentially illegal for serfs to be in place. But at that point, there was still this big mixture of how do we behave? What can we do? What can't we do? How do we interact with the Tsar? Who are we? So there was, maybe call it an existential movement, right? Where people are trying to figure out how to exist in this new world. And in doing so, the 19th century was really full of people trying to answer these bigger questions. And so they launched this intellectual movement called the intelligentsia. So this whole century, the 19th century, is really built around these sort of academics, these intelligent, educated people who are trying to really challenge the status quo. They're trying to figure out morality and philosophy and bigger themes? Well, the intelligentsia is really being led by thinkers like Dostoyevsky and Tolstoy and other people who are willing to share their views and put them out into the world. But there is a big problem here. The problem is that the Orthodox Church does not like these conversations. And in fact, they are doing everything they can to sort of contain it and make sure that people are living within the realms of the scripture being taught and the theology being taught. So there's this big sort of censorship taking place. Anything being written by authors really has to be put through the sieve of censorship, and it makes it almost impossible to ask questions that move people forward. So put yourself in Dostoevsky's shoes. This is a person who himself was very orthodox and was very much a follower of the church, but also had these big questions, right? And wanted to explore them psychologically and philosophically. And everything was just really being put under a watchful eye. So that is the environment in which these people are trying to write these books. Now, before we jump into the next stage of thinking around these books, I really want to point out or hone in on the idea of this moral and spiritual theme that people are dealing with. This is a time where the population is trying to figure out their relationship with God, their relationship with their czar, and what they're supposed to be doing with themselves. And so everybody is really in this struggle to not only provide food for their families, but to provide some sort of meaning to their life. And so when you read these Russian novels, especially the novels that are coming from the 19th century, they are packed full of bigger, harder questions that are just all about the nature of being and who we are. So understand that before we get into some of the details. Now, the next thing I want to point out when you're reading Russian literature is that the names of these characters can be quite confusing, especially if you're not used to pronouncing Russian names. The syntax of things can throw you off a little bit, and I want to make sure that it doesn't ruin your experience of the book. The first time I read Crime and Punishment by Dostoyevsky or the Brothers Karamazov, I really struggled for several hundred pages with the names. Every time I would come across a character's name, not only would I have to slow down to try and pronounce it in my head, but I would also kind of have these moments of why is the author referring to this person by their entire full name? It's quite common for authors to share a very formal use of the Russian name. And to give you a sense of what that means, a person in Russia has three parts to their name. So there is the first name, there is the patronymic name, which is a name that is derived from the father's first name, and then there's the surname. So for instance, in The Idiot, which we're going to be reading by Dostoevsky, the main character is Prince Mishkin, but his name is Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin. So Lev is his first name, okay? And sometimes the author will say a shortened version of the first name, an expanded version of the first name. So you really have to do this sort of mental acrobatic thing to remember who's who. And there are also times, I found this happens a lot in the Brothers Karamazov, where not only would we refer to their first name in a shortened or extended version, but we will refer to them by some nickname or other. So sometimes you're having to keep track of 4 or 5 different names and realize, oh, we're talking about the same person. So it is really beneficial in your note-taking system to keep a list of characters and the different sort of variations on their name. But let's stick with this concept. There are 3 segments to a person's name. The first name, and then the patronymic version of the name. So this is derived from the father's first name. So in the main character, again, we've got Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin. Nikolaevich is the patronymic part of his name. Now, the patronymic part is not chosen by the parents, but rather it's sort of formed by the father's name, as I mentioned. So for men, the endings of these names are different than they are for women. If you're a man, your patronymic name will end in either Ovich, O-V-I-C-H, or Evich, E-V-I-C-H. And they're, again, typically added to the father's first name. So for Prince Mishkin, he is the son of Nikolai. So because he's a man, he becomes Nikolaevich. right? The O-V-I-C-H is added to the name. Now, if you're a woman, it's a little different. The patronymic name is formed by adding Ovna, O-V-N-A, or Evna, E-V-N-A. So this is helpful because sometimes when you are reading a story, you can at least identify the gender of the character based off of whether that middle name ends in Ovich, Evich, or Ovna, Evna, right? That's another trick to sort of keep your characters straight. Now, there is a sort of wrench to throw into this situation here. If the character is an orphan, right, those whose fathers were unknown, they would typically be given a patronymic name of Ivanovich or Ivanovna. Sometimes I really struggle with trying to get these names out. Ivanovich, I-V-A-N-O-V-I-C-H, or Ivanovna, I-V-A-N-O-V-N-A. Yeah. Now, if you are an expert in this and I'm pronouncing things wrong, please feel free to send me a message. I'm learning myself. I don't claim to know everything here. I'm simply sharing with you what I've learned as a student of these books and as I've tried to improve myself these studies. And hopefully we can help you as we're all learning together. Okay, now that we understand the historical background that these authors were dealing with, as well as how they approach the naming of their characters, I want to talk next about the writing style, especially of Dostoyevsky. But I'm going to compare in just a moment the two most famous Russian authors, Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky. There are many, I get that, very, very many fantastic Russian authors, but this podcast would go on for hours if we looked at all of them, and I'm not honestly qualified to talk about all of them because I haven't read all of their books. But I have spent a lot of time with Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's dig into Dostoyevsky's writing style. Again, I want to arm the book club members in order to be prepared for The Idiot. And I think it's really important that you understand how he approached his narrative, his characters, and his themes as a writer. So first of all, let's talk about themes and his narrative style. So Dostoyevsky is known for exploring the psychological depth of a character, right? So he loves to put his characters in existential dilemmas, and then he wants to see how they react in terms of the human condition. So a lot of Dostoyevsky's work happens on the inside of a character, right? It is that inner turmoil that makes his work so popular and fascinating, especially among people who like to study philosophy, which is me. Philosophy is my bread and butter. As you know, I'm going back to school to study philosophy. And that is why Dostoyevsky is so important to me, because he had a really strong grasp of these existential questions and how human beings felt anxiety, fear, passion, and all of the other emotions in regard to those questions. Well, what does this mean? So when you are reading Dostoyevsky, there are going to be points in the book that are less about events and plot and can be larger, more intense inner dialogues. Sometimes there will be long stories or parables or analogies or whatever you want to call them in whatever form, where he is trying to not only express the inner turmoil of a character, but to get a major thematic question from his brain to yours as the reader. So, if you've ever read the Brothers Karamazov, for example, the story of the Grand Inquisitor is a fantastic example of that. Or the story of The Onion, where the woman is dragged out of, she's her guardian angel tries to drag her out of hell by the use of an onion. And as long as the onion doesn't break, she gets to be pulled out. I won't ruin that story for you because I'd like for you to read that book. But those stories will go on sometimes for pages, and you as a reader are probably trained at this point, if you are reading actively, to be expecting action and plot and all of these like really fancy, I'm not going to say car explosions, but sometimes when we watch movies on TV, they're just so full of attention-grabbing devices that it's really hard to be distracted. You at times won't have that luxury with these Russian writers, because to them, plot devices like that aren't as important as thematic exploration. So why is this so important to authors like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky? I mean, we mentioned that they are really writing at a time where there's all sorts of revolution happening and people are confused and they're trying to be sort of a voice of reason, right? But let's add an extra layer, and a heavy layer at that, to Dostoevsky's historical experience. This man was essentially convicted of really upsetting the environment of politics because he was in a circle of people, of intellectuals, called the Petrashevsky Circle. And in the Petrashevsky Circle, they talked about everything from civil servants to literature and philosophy and political reform. They sort of critiqued the government and the church and this whole idea of serfdom and why it was bad. I mean, they were speaking out against major players. And, well, he was caught in this group of people, and the Tsarist regime sent him and the other members of the Petrashevsky Circle to essentially a Serbian prison camp. And he was there from 1850 to 1854. So for 4 years, he's in Siberia just freezing to death, right? He's being exposed to physical labor and poor food, and he's just being treated awfully by the guards. And this experience had a massive impact on his later writings because before this experience, his books definitely had a specific flavor to them. Some would say they're happier, they're brighter, they're a little more positivistic. But after this experience, he really dug into what it meant for human suffering and mortality and sort of redemption from your acts. He explored more of the good versus evil kind of thing, right? So his work became much weightier. In fact, one of his most popular books, The House of the Dead, is this semi-autobiographical account of his experiences in prison and the lives of the convicts that he lived with while he was there. I'd like to take just a second to hit pause on this show to tell you about the readwellpodcast.com. If you go there, you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter on reading deeply. Simply go to thereadwellpodcast.com, enter your email, and I'll send you a message every Wednesday at 9 a.m. on how to become a deep and thoughtful reader. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show. Let's talk for just a moment about the specific work, The Idiot. I think it's important, if you're going to be jumping into this book with us, that you know what you're getting into. Now, The Idiot is a book that comes from a very special place for many people because unlike many of the works of that time, we have a character here that Dostoevsky was terrified to write. You see, in the beginning, he wanted the main character, Prince Mishkin, to sort of be pulled in lots of directions and temptations, and ultimately he scrubbed those ideas. If you go through his notebooks about how he was preparing this novel, you see that Prince Mishkin in the beginning was very different from the Prince Mishkin that ended up on the page. And we are glad that that happened because the biggest sort of reason to read The Idiot is to sort of see the eternal optimist at play. Prince Mishkin is this person who is known to be completely naive and always unaware of social norms and is essentially just bringing happiness and kindness and understanding and Christ-like love to the situation. Now, here's where this book gets its fingernails. So Dostoevsky took this ideal character, this positive human being where nothing could get to him, and he surrounded Prince Mishkin with the most vile, horrible, hateful, conniving, deceiving people in the world. And the goal of the book is to ask this major thematic question: does the goodness of Prince Mishkin have an effect on the world after he's lived in it? Is he able to influence those around him by being good? Or does his influence over time essentially amount to nothing? Do people continue going on being their bad selves and doing the things that they do, irregardless of his kindness and his love? So it is just this great book because whether or not he has an effect on the world, usually when you read this, you walk away thinking, geez, I kind of want to be a little more like Prince Mishkin. I don't want to be ornery and cruel and angry. I want to be a little more of a positive force in the world. So, yes, Dostoyevsky, again, he had a really strong connection to the Russian Orthodox Church. He was very, very Christian in his background. And he wanted to try to put a Christ-like figure in a very un-Christ-like situation to see what would happen. Now, here's the thing. Whether you're religious or not, that doesn't matter. It does not matter whether you believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior or not, or whether there's a God or not, because you live in this world. And in this world, you are confronted with good actors and bad actors, and you as a human have to make your choice as to how you're going to interface with those people. And so you can approach this book from a philosophical standpoint like I do, which is to sort of analyze morality and ethics and virtue. Or you can approach it from a religious standpoint to try and be more Christ-like. However you do it, it will really benefit you, and I think you're going to absolutely love the book. Now, we are really moving through these concepts here, and what I want to do is give you a couple tips on how to enjoy a work of Russian literature, and then I want to walk you through and sort of compare and contrast both Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky. I want you to get a sense of these two writers because I really think if you at least understand them, you'll be able to enter this world and really enjoy these books. The first tip I can give you when you open a book of this sort of stature is not to really slow down your reading pace. I always talk about reading slowly, reading carefully, and enjoying it. I cannot stress how important that is with these texts, mainly because, one, you need to read slowly enough that you can actually pronounce the names. If you don't take time to learn how to pronounce the names, it will probably bother you because these books are not short. I'm holding The Idiot in my hand right now, and this particular version is working up to, it actually passes 700 pages, not a small book. And so if for 700 pages you can't pronounce any of the names, you're going to lose sort of your grip on reality. So read slowly, and for the first 30, 50, even 100 pages, you're going to be bumping into these people and these names, and you're probably going to have a hard time remembering who's who. That's okay. I promise you, if you give yourself patience and you write the names down and you keep a list of characters, that within 50 to 100 pages, you're going to know these people just as well as you would know, Harry and Ron in Harry Potter or, Hercule Poirot in an Agatha Christie mystery. Their names will start to make sense. It should be pointed out that that statement needs to be made because not only are the names hard to pronounce, but there are often in these bigger books many names, many characters, and that is definitely the case with The Idiot. We're dealing with multiple families here, and we're dealing with love affairs, and we're dealing with just, all sorts of craziness. There are many, many characters here. These authors did not shy away from big narratives and big worldviews, and so you're going to be confronted with a lot of people. But if you can do your best to keep track of the main characters, that will get you into the book and into their stories. Let's talk about the difference between Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky. I think this is a fun conversation to have. I could probably talk about this for hours because I love these two authors. I love them so much. I read Tolstoy for the first time when I was 13, and it just knocked my socks off. I didn't get into Dostoyevsky until just a few years ago, and now I'm angry that I didn't have him earlier in my life. It's just it's a wonderful place to be. But let's talk about their different writing styles first, and then we're going to talk about sort of how they approach themes. I want to also talk about sort of how they address psychology and philosophy a little differently, how they deal with character development, and then we'll end on some narrative structure. First of all, writing style. So Tolstoy himself, let me back up. I'm going to be making some general statements, and for anybody who wants to sort of battle on these ideas, it's not possible to go through every work of fiction they've written in this short podcast, because there are exceptions to every rule. So these are blanket statements, but in general, they are pretty fitting. So Tolstoy himself can be a pretty broad and expansive writer, right? He's really meticulous when it comes to describing settings and characters and, sort of the physical and the psychological descriptions of these people. So his style tends to be more straightforward, maybe a little more realistic. And his work will be more on the external life of the character and sort of the social conditions that they're in. So it's almost like as a reader, you're watching these characters from the outside as they sort of interact and bump into each other and fight and kill each other and all sorts of craziness. Now, Dostoevsky, in contrast, is going to be more intense on the psychological side of the characters. So he's going to dive into their inner turmoil, sort of those moral conflicts that his characters will face. And his books usually explore some sort of mental or emotional state. There's going to be bigger dialogues, sometimes monologues that you'll face. Don't get lost in those. They could go on for a couple pages, and it's okay to go back and reread those monologues before you kind of move on, because there have been times where I've read them and thought halfway in, oh, we're still with the same character. I'm in his head, and I need to back up and start this point over. But that's important to do with Dostoevsky because he is trying to help you get seated in this person's mental mind model. And it is, my goodness, it is just a crazy mental exercise. He's just fantastic at it. Now, let's get into themes here. So Tolstoy, he really liked to explore social issues, morality. He liked to look at the meaning of life. And his books typically had some sort of moral teaching behind them. There was always an inequality of sort of the Russian society at play. We talked about the czars and serfdom and all of this stuff, right? But in terms of like major thematic ideas, redemption is at play here, materialism is at play, the idea of beauty and avarice, all these things are at play for Tolstoy. And Dostoevsky, again, being so focused on the psychological stuff, he's really concerned with the relationship between good and evil within your soul. Right? Again, he's coming from this as a very orthodox Russian Christian sort of thing, but I love that he doesn't force the idea of his religion on you as you read. In fact, he often presents very strong arguments against Christendom so that you can see both sides of the argument. And I think he's really wise for doing that. I think people that come at you and just say, this is the only way to think about stuff, you have to believe things the way I do, can be sort of, there's no credibility there. I think Dostoevsky is so credible because he presents both sides of a psychological argument. The good, the evil, the bad, the whatever, the beautiful, the ugly. But he doesn't judge either side. He doesn't judge you. And that's, again, if I go back to the Brothers Karamazov, I know I'm geeking out here about Russian literature. Oh my gosh, I love this stuff. But if you dig into that book, this is a complicated book. It should not be your first Dostoevsky novel by any means. But once you get there, you're going to meet a character named Ivan. Ivan is one of the sons, and he is the secularist. He is the philosopher, the bookworm, the know-it-all, sort of black and white logical guy. He has a conversation with his brother, Alyosha, who is the exact opposite. Alyosha is the Christ-like character. There's always usually one in Dostoevsky's novels somewhere. Alyosha is a monk in training who is trying to just bring spiritual and love and kindness to every conversation. Well, there's a big part where they clash, and in this section of the Brothers Karamazov, it's called The Grand Inquisitor. And I love this section because, again, Dostoevsky is presenting the for arguments and the against arguments for his religion, his Christ-like religion. And then he lets you as the reader decide what's important to you. And I just think that is a huge mark of maturity and intellectual stability from an author's point of view. I love it. Now, if we dig into the philosophy and the psychology of these two authors, Tolstoy, they both loved to really explore these ideas. Both are definitely very philosophical. But Tolstoy's approach to character development, again, is more external. So we're talking about lots of things that are going to be tangible in terms of society, right? Justice and how people are treated and all of these other things. Again, Dostoevsky on the philosophical side is going to be dealing with more inner things like human depravity and existential crises, those kinds of things. And in terms of character development, that leads right into how do we take a character from the beginning of a novel through to the end and develop that person? Well, that's why we read novels, isn't it? To see how our characters change over the course of a couple hundred pages. Or in the case of these authors, 1,000 pages. It is no small effort to read these guys. But Tolstoy's characters are often again, described in their relationship to the world and to others. So he's going to talk about, I think maybe the best word is influence, right? How they're influenced by social norms and people and family and politics and society and all of that other stuff. I think that's really valuable as a human being, because I know I wake up every day and I'm influenced by my family and my community and my everything, right? So reading Tolstoy is very enlightening. It's like holding up a mirror to yourself as an agent in social context. Dostoyevsky, again, his characters are more likely to be unpredictable. They are sort of pushed or moved forward by some sort of inner drive. They have some sort of compulsion or crisis that they're dealing with. And so they usually have to face these conflicts, and that is going to cause them to act irrationally at times. And sometimes in the books, you'll have this dramatic shift in behavior, which I think is very realistic, right? I mean, how many times in your life have you had this internal conflict that has it's eating you alive, and it continues to weigh on you and bother you and stress you out until one day you either snap and break, or you just say never again, and you change and you do something different because you've had this moment, right, where you just can't live this way anymore. That is reading a Dostoevsky novel. Now, last but of course not least, I want to talk about narrative structure really quickly. Structure being, how does the author get his book from page 1 to page 900 and do so in a logical way? Well, Tolstoy tends to be a little more linear when he's writing. So his novels like War and Peace or Anna Karenina, they are covering this huge array of characters and subplots, but they usually are pretty coherent in their structure moving forward, right? They usually have a linear path to get from A to B. Dostoevsky, not so much, because he's focusing on internal problems. Sometimes his work can feel a little more fragmented or chaotic. And again, it's because of that sort of intense internal psychological drama that happens, which makes things and events a little more chaotic. Now, also, I don't know if Tolstoy was doing this, but I do know Dostoevsky was. Dostoevsky was publishing his works in installments, essentially. So he would get into these contracts with publications like magazines almost, where they would hire him to write a novel in installments for their readers. And this is how many of the books like Crime and Punishment came about. He would sign a contract, and then he would have to deliver a full novel within the course of a year or what have you. And that put an immense amount of pressure on Dostoevsky to not only kind of keep the work going, but to get it out in chunks. And so that definitely made it a little more challenging for him to keep the flow linear, right? Because it all had to come out in pieces. That does not disparage his work. I think Dostoevsky is one of the most influential, powerful, and just lovely writers ever to grace my bookshelves, for sure. I have found that when I read his books, it is the best possible opportunity for me to see myself in the pages and try to improve myself. But again, I like philosophy, I like psychology, I like the inner turmoil of human beings because I experience that inner turmoil of human beings. I have hundreds of books where I can read just plot-driven narrative, right? Car explosion led to this, which led to that, which led to capturing the murderer, and yada, yada, yada. And those are great. Those are absolutely great. But there is nothing like a Dostoevsky book that will crack open your soul. Hey, if you found this episode helpful at the Read Well podcast, I want to first of all thank you for listening. It means a lot to me that you're here and just geeking out on books the way that I do. I find that my skin tingles when it comes to reading books because I love it so much. And I want you to understand something. You don't have to read Russian literature to have your skin tingle. I have made many comments on this show where I love to read Agatha Christie and Stephen King and whatever. I just love the written word in all of its forms. But here on this show, I tend to focus on things with a philosophical or a psychological lens because I really enjoy those books that I can sink my teeth into and have some good conversation with in terms of an exchange with the author. So if you found this show helpful in terms of helping you get back into reading, or you find it is interesting, I would love to just ask two favors of you. First of all, share it with a friend. Let a friend know, hey, I got this podcast out there. There's this guy who won't stop talking about books. Check it out. Share it with somebody that you love. And two, if you wouldn't mind going over to Apple Podcasts and just leaving a review. You can leave a 1 to 5 star review. Right now we're up to 41 reviews, which is just mind-blowing for me. And it's rated at 4.7 out of 5 stars as of this recording. I would sure love to get that higher so that we can get a little more exposure for the show. So I know that takes time out of your day, but it would sure mean a lot if you would take a few minutes to go to Apple Podcasts, search up the Read Well podcast, and then let me know how I'm doing so that I can improve the show for you and your reading experience. So until next week, thank you so much for listening. And as always, remember to read slowly, take notes, and apply the ideas. I'll see you next time. If you'd like to take your reading to the next level, then head on over to thereadwellpodcast.com. There you'll find daily posts on how to read well. You'll also get access to all of my book notes and tools for becoming a better reader. And as always, don't forget to read slowly, take notes, and apply the ideas. Thank you for listening to the Read Well podcast.